The scripture this morning is from Genesis 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome, and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind, bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let there be signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome for the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day.
And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in
If you haven't figured out yet, today is Mother's Day. This is a day that is both a beautiful celebration, but it's also a day that is very difficult for many. For me, today is actually quite a complicated day for a whole host of reasons, but a big one is knowing the variety of experiences of people in our congregation and people that are in my life. It's actually something of a difficult task to preach about motherhood on a day like this. And part of the reason that it's difficult is that it's kind of a hard thing to define what exactly it means to be a mother. And yes, I realize the irony of me, a man, trying to define motherhood. But go with me for a little bit. On one hand, we might say that someone who has given birth to their own biological child is a mother. But what of the one who adopts a child, raising them as their own? Or the one who is a foster parent? Surely they are mothers as well. What of the one who is a stepmother? What of the one who has longed for a child that has not come, or the one who has lost a child before they were born? Surely these experience motherhood as well. And what of those whose families are grown, or who never had biological children of their own, yet invested themselves in the lives of children in our church, or in our school, or in the neighborhood, or somewhere else? It seems to me that they are certainly mothers as well. To speak of motherhood on Mother's Day is a complicated thing because of the different experiences of motherhood, and because of the many varied identities that are all expressions of what it means to be a mother. This week, as I've spent some time thinking about how complicated it is to define a mother, or what a mother is, I began to realize that maybe the primary definition of motherhood is not a noun, but it's a verb. Perhaps motherhood is not defined by a particular person or identity or role, but rather that motherhood is primarily defined as an act or a way of being. There's a million ways to be a mother, but the act of mothering, I think, is fairly simple to define. Sure, the act of mothering takes many forms, but it seems to me that the core of what is in the act of mothering centers on two things, which are creation and nurture, or formation. Creation has to do with bringing something into existence, and nurture has to do with the ongoing formation of that something. And in many ways, creation and nurture are really two forms of the same thing. To nurture something is really simply to be part of the ongoing process of creation and formation. And creation is not simply a one-time act. It's something that requires time and ongoing work to bring something new into existence. And if we see motherhood as this act of creation and nurturing, what we very quickly see is that these acts are central not just to the very nature of mothers, but also to the very nature of God. The very first thing that God does in the Bible is to create. And one of the striking things about the story that we've just heard from Genesis is the joy with which God creates. See, in the ancient world, when this story from Genesis was just a story that was being told around campfires, long before it was ever written down, there were other creation stories floating around in that part of the world. One of the biggest and most well-known ones came from the Babylonians in something called the Enuma Elish. And in that story, the moment of creation looks very different than it does in Genesis. In the Babylonian creation story, essentially two powerful gods get into a fight. And when one loses and is killed, they are ripped in half, and the one half becomes the ground and the earth itself, and the other half becomes the sky, and everything that falls out is what we see as creation. That's one of the major creation stories at the time of Genesis. And in that story, all of creation is born of a side effect or an afterthought as a result of cosmic violence. Now, with that story as a backdrop, we can look at Genesis and see something very, very different. In Genesis, the God Yahweh creates the world on purpose and out of love. Creating is the first and primary characteristic of God in the Genesis story. And this act of creating is something that brings Yahweh immense joy and satisfaction. Yahweh repeatedly looks at all that has been created and is pleased and calls it good. Creating is so central to who God is that God builds in the act of creation to that which God creates. God creates all of these plants and animals and fish and birds and humans and then sends them off to create more of themselves, to participate in the divine act of creation. The act of creation and nurturing is very closely tied to the act of motherhood. But it's also at the core of the nature of who God is. To create and nurture in whatever form that may take is to participate in the same divine act of mothering that we see in Genesis for today. It is that act of creating and nurturing that I think it is in that act of creating and nurturing that we can see something about who God is. But it's also something that I think every one of us, female or male, can participate in. And in fact, I think we're hardwired to participate in the act of creation. Now, to be clear here, I am not saying that every person or every woman is hardwired to give birth or be a parent or anything like that. There are clearly people who are not, and they're fully human as much as anybody else is. What I'm saying is that creativity in general is something that is wired into all people in one form or another. And in fact, I think we can see in our culture today ways in which this need for creation is bursting out, particularly when it's been denied to us. In the past 10 or 15 years or so, you may have noticed a movement that is springing up all across our country and across the world, and it's called the Maker Movement. Now, if you haven't heard about this, the Maker Movement is part of a very broad way of describing people who are all becoming very interested in creating things. And it covers all sorts of stuff. It covers things from computer programming to robots to woodworking to knitting and quilting and painting and gardening and canning and vegetables and all sorts of other stuff. And I think that the reason that this movement is happening now in our culture is that more and more of our lives have become automated. We've become more and more removed from actually creating things in our daily lives. And as a result, there is this whole movement of people who are crying out to be able to create something. The need to create runs deep in who we are as human beings. Now, some of you might say, well, yeah, that's great, but I'm not really a creative person. Or we might even think of some professions as not being particularly creative. We might just say, well, I'm pretty logical and, I don't use that part of my brain to be creative and, maybe I'm just an accountant or I work with computers or something, so I'm not creative at all. Well, if you find yourself in that category, let me remind you of something. For you more logical folks out there, remember exactly what it is that God does when God creates. At the very beginning of that story in Genesis, God brings order to chaos. That is the way that God creates. Believe me, if you know how to look for it, there is an amazing creative beauty in a very well done spreadsheet. All of us have this need buried in us somewhere to participate in this divine mothering act of creation and nurturing. It's one of the things that I think ties us together as human beings. To be creative is a divine act. But it's also fundamentally a communal act as well. Yes, many of the things that people do to be creative are somewhat solitary, or we may think of them doing them by themselves. But even in those things, it is the knowledge and the skills that they use and learn and develop and pass on that all rely on other people in one way or another. Yes, I might be out in my garage building something on a table saw, but that piece of knowledge to be able to build that thing was something that was passed down to me from friends, or family or relatives or someone in a book or even on the internet. What's more, that piece of knowledge that I'm using does not end with me. At some point, I will pass it on to someone else or a next generation or whoever it is. To create is a communal act, even if you are by yourself. And if we want to clearly see how creation and nurture is a communal act, we need look no further than the church. When we talk about what it means to be the church, we will often talk about the church as a Christian community. More often than not, we talk about the task of creating Christian community in the church. But I do not think we have ever spoken of our Christian community as having been already created in the past tense. It is not something that is ever finished or completed. Our task as the church is to continually create Christian community together. Our task is to continually form each other, to nurture each other as we go through life together. It is a task that is never quite complete. It is always changing, and it requires all of us to take an active role in forming and nurturing each other's lives. At times, we are the ones doing the nurturing, and at other times, we are the ones being nurtured. And it doesn't matter how old we are. Throughout our whole lives, we go back and forth between forming others and being formed by others around us as we work to create this thing we call Christian community. And so today, as we celebrate this divine act of motherhood and creation, as we celebrate those who create and form and nurture us in our lives, I want to invite us all into an act of thankfulness and creation, a communal act of thankfulness and creation. And it was once said to me that all children are artists until somebody tells them that they're not. So today I'm going to ask you to get in touch with your inner child and your inner artist a little bit. As you may have noticed earlier, we passed out, after the children's story, passed out these little cards. I would like you to find those. Hopefully everybody has one. We have a few more. You can raise your hand here in a little bit. You will also notice that on the inside of the pews, right in the corners, there should be, on the inside aisle, there should be a stack of colored pencils or crayons or something to that effect, some sort of writing utensil. What I'm going to invite you to do now, to close our sermon time together, is I'd like you to break up into groups of 3 or 4 people. And you have 2 tasks. 2 tasks. The first is to simply create a card for someone in your life who has had a nurturing influence on you. And I would like to expand this to anybody. Yes, maybe it's a mother or another woman in your life. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's someone who has already passed on and is not here in this life anymore. But I want you to think of someone in your life who has had a particularly strong influence, a nurturing influence, a forming influence on you. And I want you to write them a card of thanks, of love, draw them a picture, whatever it is. The other thing that I want you to do is, in your groups of 3 or 4, I want you to share who that person is and explain to others why that person had such an important influence on your life. Tell them what it is they did and how you might pass on what they have given you. So, I would invite us all to find some people to talk with, grab some writing utensils. They're scattered out throughout the congregation. Grab a card and share some stories. And raise your hand if you would like another card. I would invite us all to come back together, and as we close our time and prepare to sing number 482, I would just leave you with the final thought that it is important to name the important people in your life, and it's important to tell them why they're important. Perhaps it's just because of the week that we've had here at our church, but it's important to actually express the things and the love that we have for those who are close to us and those who have made a big impact, whether that be a parent, a relative, a friend, or someone else. We invite us to stand and sing our closing hymn, number 482, Mothering God, You Gave Me Birth.